Hi, this is Simon Drew, and you're listening to the Walled Garden Podcast. This show belongs to the podcast network of the Walled Garden Philosophical Society, an international community of philosophers and seekers dedicated to the pursuit of truth, wisdom, virtue, and the divine, wherever they may be found. To find out more, go to thewalledgarden.com. But for now, let's caretake the gardens of our minds, one meaningful conversation at a time. Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of the Walled Garden Podcast. So today I wanted to introduce you to another one of our contributors in the Walled Garden. As many of you will know, we've recently brought on a bunch of philosophers and podcasters and project managers from all around the world, and that includes the person who I'm featuring on the podcast today. His name is Joshua Bertolotti. Now, I do go into a little bit of detail about how Joshua and I came to know each other when I dive into the episode here. But I do want to mention to you, so Joshua, he is the host of the In Search of Wisdom podcast, which I'm sure that many of you will know by now. Joshua is also the writer behind the Perennial Meditations Substack email that he's got going on, which I really can't recommend highly enough. Go check that out because he's writing some beautiful stuff there. And on top of that, I've just found Joshua to be an incredibly thoughtful philosopher. He's somebody who is obsessed with the questions. He just wants to keep on asking better and better questions and diving deep into seeking answers to those questions. And I've really found Joshua to be such a beautiful sparring partner for philosophical conversations because he's somebody who is very happy and comfortable taking time in the unknowing, in the uncertainty of so many of these questions in order to get a little bit closer to some kind of certainty or some kind of knowing. But nonetheless, he's comfortable in that space between the unknowing and the knowing. And I find that to be comforting in itself. And so when it comes to Joshua's involvement in the Walled Garden, he is currently contributing to the Walled Garden. Obviously, his podcast, In Search of Wisdom, is becoming a part of the Walled Garden Philosophical Society's podcast network. And on top of that, he is contributing to a grove in the Walled Garden called the Perennial Tradition, where he's exploring so many of these brilliant questions, these great traditions of seeking wisdom throughout the ages. And on top of that, he is doing philosophical mentoring. And if you'd like to apply to get mentoring with Joshua, then you can go to thewalledgarden.com/mentoring. So now on to today's episode. Many of you will know that we held a series of meetups recently in the Walled Garden where we were exploring great thinkers of the past and present who have really influenced our own thinking. And that's what I'm sharing with you today in terms of Joshua Bertolotti. This is the meetup that he facilitated, where he was talking about the poetic genius of Heraclitus, this incredible philosopher and poet and somewhat a mystic from about 500 years before Christ, I believe. And so this is a really wonderful tribute that Joshua gives to Heraclitus in all of his complexity. And so for those of you who don't know Heraclitus, I know that this is going to serve as a wonderful introduction to his thinking. And for those of you who do know Heraclitus, then I'm sure that this episode is really going to reinvigorate your fascination with this brilliant character of the past. Okay, so with that said, we do have an event coming up this week, and it's going to be facilitated again by Joshua Bertolotti. So it's going to be this Friday at 8:30 p.m. PST, that's California time. So again, that's going to be Friday, October 14th. And the theme is going to be the perennial tradition. Universal truths for living in an age of isolation. And once again, as I said, that is going to be facilitated by Joshua Bertolotti. So if you like this episode today, I know you're going to love this event coming up this week. We would love to see you. It is free to attend. So just go to thewalledgarden.com/events. And with that said, I'm now going to leave you in the capable hands of Joshua Bertolotti discussing the poetic wisdom of Heraclitus.
Oh, it's an absolute pleasure. I'm so happy to be here to facilitate something on Heraclitus. I love seeing the friendly faces, and I have to say some of those words are too kind, but the idea of a soft-spoken powerhouse might be a good introduction to these polarities that we're going to talk about today in terms of Heraclitus. So let me share some slides here, and we'll see if we can go through. How are we looking there? Can everybody see that?
It's looking pretty good.
All right. Well, wonderful. Again, grateful and happy to facilitate this. Today, we're going to be talking about Heraclitus. But before we get into the life and philosophy of Heraclitus, I want to share a quick story about how I came to land on Heraclitus as a topic when Simon asked. And it was a couple months ago. I actually went to this amusement park that's fairly close to my house, and it was just me and my young son, who is getting ready to turn 4. And it was an extremely hot summer day. The park was empty. There's no lines to be found anywhere. And we started out on my son's favorite roller coaster that he's just barely tall enough to get on. And since there were no lines, the person running the ride let us go, as many times as we wanted to, or at least as many times as my son wanted to. And we must have rode this roller coaster 15 to 20 times, just back to back. And I have to say, around ride number 10, I was feeling like I was ready to go ahead and get off of this ride and move on to something else. But the experience, it got me thinking about Heraclitus and this idea that everything is in motion, this constant change. And I was having to ask myself, I don't know if I like that, and I thought it would be a good topic to explore and see what that means and maybe what we can do about it. So specifically, briefly, we'll chat about Heraclitus, a little bit about his life and his influence. I want to touch on philosophy as a way of life and maybe where that fits in with Heraclitus, how the world works, and we'll get a little weird and complicated talking about these polarities and paradoxes and opposites. My wife sometimes says I'm starting to get a little weird when I get into some of these things. So just full disclosure, we are going to get a little weird, but that's okay. And then hopefully we'll spend about the last half focused on what I think is the most important, this wisdom for daily life. How do we integrate this in our lives? What does it mean? And I'm looking forward to it. So we'll see where it goes here. Heraclitus, simply put, ancient Greek pre-Socratic philosopher. So he lived around 500 BCE in the city of Ephesus, which is present-day Turkey. And interestingly, he was actually heir to the throne, and he gave that up to search for wisdom. So who doesn't love that? And strangely, right around the same time in the East is when the Buddha, also someone, heir to a throne, who gives that up in pursuit of wisdom. His philosophy influenced many great thinkers. When you think of Plato, Marcus Aurelius, the Stoics, and even some of the more modern philosophers like Nietzsche and Heidegger. And as I said, a little difficult to understand, known as the philosopher of riddles. Socrates supposedly said, when asked about Heraclitus's writings, is that the part I understand is excellent. And so too, I dare say, is the part I don't understand. And he was a bit of a difficult figure when you think of maybe Socrates, of someone that wasn't afraid to go against the grain. He was not a fan of philosophers. He said they were too focused on learning and too specialized. Also not a fan of poets. He basically he wrote in his what survives today as fragments. He called them fools, not necessarily seeing that there's a need for conflict. I think a fun fact is he's known as the weeping philosopher. So when you look at many of the paintings that survive today, you'll see tears running down his face. Often you'll see Democritus, who is known as the laughing philosopher, in some of these paintings, which I honestly love. It reminds me of something I read a couple of years ago that has stuck with me, that Kierkegaard wrote. He said, "What if everything is a misunderstanding? What if laughter is really tears?" So it's an interesting thing to ponder, like, what are tears? What if tears are a sign of wisdom and strength? So these are some of the things we'll maybe get into a little bit later. In terms of a philosophy of life, often it's broken up in a few different parts. You have metaphysics, or simply how the world works. Much of Heraclitus's philosophy probably falls here. Then you have ethics or virtues. Think of like cardinal virtues. And then over here you have exercises or practices, maybe prayer, meditation, journaling, and things like that. So when we think about how the world works, I kind of talked about it a little bit already, but he really stresses the idea that the only constant is change. Everything is in motion, all is in flux. So let's do a little bit of trivia here for a couple minutes. The Earth is currently spinning, and then while also at the same time, it's moving or orbiting around the sun. So a couple questions to throw out is question one: how fast do we think the Earth is spinning? And then question two is, how fast is Earth orbiting around the sun? You can put your answers in the chat, or jump on and throw something out. But what do we think? And Simon, I can't quite see the chat, so maybe if you could assist if we get anything in there. we'll give it a minute, and if we don't get anything, I'll throw some numbers out.
We got a great answer from Bonnie here. Crazy fast, and she says former science teacher. And we've also got 17,000 mpb. I was just going to say, I know that it's fast enough to be completely baffled by the fact that we are constantly moving that fast. That's all I know.
Yeah, and it's it's a little bit of a trick, because as you say, you Google it, and it really depends when it comes to speed. It depends on in relation to what and things like that. But the Earth is spinning at 1,000 miles per hour. And then while at the same time, the speed that it's orbiting around the sun is 67,000 miles per hour. So crazy fast is absolutely right. But as we sit here, it's something we don't necessarily readily notice and see. We understand it, but maybe not at as deep of a level as we can, as Heraclitus might insist. It's everything is moving, it's changing, it's all in flux. And he would say things like the sun is new again all day. He'd talk about harmony. He has this edge of really, he's doesn't necessarily see conflict as bad. He's really says you have to have tension. So I'll go through a couple of the common sayings, maybe some well-known sayings. Probably the most well-known is the idea that no one steps in the same river twice. It's not the same river, and you're not the same person. If you look in fragments, it's worded a little bit different often when you see it, but the same concept. Those waters are moving. They're giving way. This and now this. And many of these sayings, he's trying to broaden our perception, or maybe broaden's not the best word, but he's trying to help us see two different points of view at the same time and be able to hold these different things. Another thing is, any day stands equal to the rest. It's very vague. It could be taken a lot of different ways. But if you think, when you read something like that, I can think of, well, any day stands equal to the rest. That is that true? But he says, whatever I say, the opposite is also true. So it can be difficult to understand, but I think we'll get there. But if you think of this, for example, I think of, the day that my daughter was born. That doesn't stand equal to the rest. But when you think about it, the day my daughter was born, that same day wasn't necessarily a significant or special day to everyone else. So it's holding these two things at the same time. Some other examples is, Heraclitus would say things like, humans value gold. Donkeys don't. They prefer trash. Or the ocean is polluted, but yet it's perfectly purified for fish. And then another one that could be taken different ways, but he says the way up is the way down. You might hear that and you could think maybe deeply about it, but we're wise to just take it simply for what it is. If we look at, we're standing at the base of the mountain, the trail going up is the way up. If we're at the peak of the mountain, that same trail is the way down. So we could think of things like yes and maybe, which come up in so many different wisdom traditions. So I want to talk a little bit about maybe some examples that show up. Let's take Seneca, for example. he writes on the shortness of life and many other places that we have to live immediately. He insists it. I can almost picture Seneca if we were in his class and he was up here lecturing us, almost yelling, pounding on the desk. The future lies in uncertainty. We've got to live right now. And this idea of being in the here and now comes up in many different wisdom traditions. But then if we think the next night, if we go back to Seneca's lecture, we might hear him also stressing, at the end of your day, take a moment and look back, reflect on the past, examine your day. So these things that seem very contradictory, but it's a yes and. Is it about living right here? Well, yes, it is. And it's also about practicing this philosophical journaling and reflecting on your day. Another example comes from Marcus Aurelius's Meditations, a very popular quote: "The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way." We've all heard this quote. Simply put, it's the obstacle is the way. If Marcus was able to come on one of our podcasts and, we were to ask, is the obstacle the way? He would say, yes, it is the way. The impediment to action advances action. And at other times, as he writes in Meditations, if there's brambles in the path, go around. If the cucumber's bitter, throw it out. So it's this annoying answer, which comes up so much in wisdom. It depends. It's yes and the difficulty of holding these opposites or these polarities at the same time. And like, here's an example to maybe give a visual image that I think provides a bit of clarity around these opposites. So according to Heraclitus, he says, without injustices, justice would mean what? He says, which many other wisdom traditions do as well, when you say one, it gives birth to the other. If we think of structure, without this idea of structure, flexibility has no meaning, and vice versa. So it's this idea of, when he says, whatever I say, the opposite is also true. You could think of, is life about being structured and having some discipline and order? He would say yes. But then to the question, is life about being flexible and adaptable? It would also be yes. And we know something like that to be true. So we'll get into it towards the end of what that means and how we might put something like that into daily life. So to talk about a few things, we'll touch on philosophy as action in the way of contemplation, how we might navigate polarities, and then think about some of Heraclitus's wisdom. And probably the best example when it comes to contemplation, at least for me, is to go to Marcus Aurelius's Meditations. Heraclitus shows up many, many times, and some of these insights show up. So here's something from book 5, where it's remind yourself at frequent intervals how quickly things come in and essentially are carried past and swept away. And you have to keep it in context of him writing this to himself, not for anyone else. Reality is like this endless flow, constantly changing. And he goes on and talks about how this might actually impact the way we think about and show up in the world. In these circumstances, isn't it just sheer stupidity for someone to get angry, agitated, or aggrieved, as though anything lasts any amount of time and could irritate us for long? The very next in 5.24, call to mind the whole of time and the brief and fleeting stretch of it that has been allocated to you. When we can take time, and when it comes to, if we think about putting some of this wisdom into our daily life, it's about reflecting deeply on it, getting a deep understanding. When you think about all of these different analogies and visuals that these people, came to, that's a lesson for us not to just take it from what they had to say, but to do the contemplation, to do the deep thinking on our own to come to these. One of my favorite quotes from Marcus Aurelius, I think is a great polarity and shows this. He says, the fruit of this life is a good character and acts for the common good. So if we look at this, when it comes to a good character, we might put on this side a focus on self, and on the other side, a focus on others. So think about the yes being true, but also the opposite. So if you asked Heraclitus, should there be a focus on self, on cultivating character? The answer would be yes. But then it's also, is life about focusing on others, acts for the common good? Yes. And with any of these, there can be an overuse. So if we think about this line right here, and maybe above it, maybe there's the benefits here, and below it, there's an overuse. When we think about the cultivation of a good character, where Stoicism often parts ways from things like the Epicureans or maybe Buddhism, where there's a withdrawal from society. If you think about maybe the Buddhist monk that is cultivating all their time, has pulled themselves out of society to essentially meditate, focus on themselves. Many people would see now we're in this overuse. Same thing with the Epicureans, kind of withdrawing themselves. It's about this yes and, the important thing right here. It's also about acts for the common good. But over here, there can be an overuse. If you think about maybe those common airplane briefings of put your gas mask on first before you help others, both are required. On one side, a common polarity that is often taught in modern times is this inhale and exhale. It's not about one or the other. Both are needed to survive. And then lastly, I just want to kind of highlight as we start to wind down a little bit is this idea of the weeping philosopher and the laughing philosopher. In doing a little bit of research on Heraclitus, I've learned that many people have, commented on this of, who they particularly take sides with. And I've heard people talk about, I side with Democritus here, that, maybe weeping is not the wisest approach. But if we think in terms of the polarities that we've been talking about, this yes and, I think we know that weeping, sadness, in whether it be the darkness of life or the beauty in all, is a wise and appropriate response at times. And same thing on the other side of, is laughing completely the wise and appropriate response at times? Of course. We don't need to take life so serious. But we can easily say, and Heraclitus talks about this, of, wisdom is seeing both of these. And when it comes to intelligence, he talks about intelligence as us going around identifying this is good, this is bad, this is just, this is unjust. But things are more interconnected. He says all is one. I don't know if anybody's ever been to a funeral, typically a sad occasion, and you have sadness, you might have weeping and crying, but also sometimes at the same time, even the emotion of laughter can come up. You can think about the joy and the experiences that you've had with this person who has moved on, and you can laugh but also at the same time experience some sadness because those times are no longer. So the lesson is, when we're thinking about a lot of these things, we can put a yes and they're more, as Heraclitus, insists, they're more of one. They're more connected than we often realize. Another quote that comes up that I'm curious everybody's thoughts on. If you could think about this for a moment, what does he mean here? Some things stay the same only by changing. Are there any examples that come to mind? You can put something in the chat if you like, or if you feel like coming on and sharing, that's lovely too.
I might jump in here. Something that I'm thinking about. I don't know if this particularly applies, but you think about a seasonal forest. It remains a seasonal forest because of the fact that it changes with the seasons. And you wouldn't call it a seasonal forest if it didn't.
Yeah.
I think Juan had the same idea. He said seasons, they change and come back.
Yeah. And you think, is a river that doesn't flow still a river? It's like, what about a human that doesn't change? So it's interesting to contemplate, and it's I think it's an important idea. So we've covered a bit of ground and touched on some of Heraclitus's life and philosophy, and some of it's a little complicated. Some of it's not quite as complicated as we can think. But I was hoping we could have a little bit of time just to maybe have an open chat and discussion of what connected and what didn't. But before I wrap it up, I just want to maybe go back to where I started, like that story, that day being on the roller coaster. If I could go back and maybe pass on any wisdom to myself, I might whisper in my ear that this moment won't last. Remember to enjoy the ride. And it's not that I want my son to stay 3 years old. I very much don't. I want him to grow and get older, and all of us, but this time is passing. That's something that just exists. And maybe the more that we can come to realize that and embrace it, it can be a deep reminder to appreciate these moments, but also at the same time, just like Heraclitus talks about the sun being new every day, like we are also new every day. We have an opportunity and a freedom to become each and every day, while also at the same time, the responsibility to appreciate that time as we move through and flow. But thank you so much. It's really been a pleasure to chat about Heraclitus, for sure.
All right, so that was Joshua Bertolotti discussing the poetic wisdom of Heraclitus. I really hope that this episode, as I said at the start, has either introduced you to Heraclitus in a way that gets you excited to learn more, or has reinvigorated that passion for this really, truly brilliant thinker. And man, Heraclitus has been such an influence on my life over the past couple of years, and I really hope that if you haven't already done so, you'll go out and grab the fragments of Heraclitus. Penguin has an excellent translation. Not that I am any scholarly judge of translations, but I found it to be quite beautiful. Nonetheless, I just wanted to remind you before we sign out of this episode that upcoming this week on Friday the 14th of October at 8:30 a.m. PST, that's California time, we're going to be meeting again with Joshua Bertolotti to discuss the perennial tradition. All right, so I really hope that you guys come along to that. Come check it out. Come say hi to Joshua. He's an incredible person, and there's going to be a Q&A and I'm sure some very thoughtful discussion. And so if you want to come along to that, just go to thewalledgarden.com/events, and hey, we'll see you there. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Walled Garden Podcast. Remember that this show is a part of the podcast network of the Walled Garden Philosophical Society. If you consider yourself to be a seeker of understanding, of wisdom, a cultivator of virtue, then we want to learn and grow with you. Just head over to thewalledgarden.com to find out more. We'll see you there, and I'll talk to you in the next episode.